Eleanor Parker stood at the edge of the train platform in Pine Hollow, Colorado, her suitcase in one hand and a crumpled letter in the other, and she heard a woman behind her say it loud enough for everyone to catch, "That's her Lord. No wonder Ohio sent her away." Eleanor did not turn around. She had promised herself she would not cry before she even arrived. She pressed her lips together, lifted her chin, and stared down the dirt road leading into the mountains. Somewhere up there, a man she had never met had built her a home. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter almost didn't get written. Eleanor Parker sat at her kitchen table in Columbus, Ohio, on a cold February morning in 1882, with a newspaper folded open beside her coffee cup, and she stared at the small advertisement in the back column, the way a person stares at something they want desperately but can't quite allow themselves to reach for. Mountain Man 36, Colorado Territory, seeking a woman of good character and honest heart for companionship and marriage. Comfort with hard work preferred. Beauty optional. She read it 4 times. Beauty optional. She had never seen those 2 words in that order in her entire life. Eleanor was 29 years old, and she had spent all 29 of those years being measured against a standard she was never going to meet. She was a large woman, wide through the shoulders, soft through the middle, with strong hands that had spent more time carrying other people's burdens than they had ever spent being held. She had a good mind. She could do figures faster than any man at the mercantile where she kept the books. She could stretch $1 further than anyone in her neighborhood and still have something left over for the church collection. She could bake bread from almost nothing and make a house feel like a home, with nothing more than a clean floor and something simmering on the stove. None of it had ever been enough. The men in Columbus saw her coming and looked somewhere else. Not out of cruelty, mostly. Just indifference. The particular kind of indifference that told a woman she existed in a category men didn't bother with. Her mother had tried to be kind about it when Eleanor was young, had said things like, "You have such a pretty face, and the right man will see you," until even her mother stopped saying it, because even her mother stopped believing it. Eleanor had 2 sisters, both married, both slim, both living the ordinary domestic lives that everyone had quietly stopped expecting Eleanor to have. She was the aunt. She was the one who came over on Sundays and minded the children and brought the pie and went home alone. She had made peace with it. That was what she told herself on most mornings. She had made peace with it, and she kept her feelings in an orderly row inside her chest like preserves on a pantry shelf, tight-lidded, not to be opened. Then she read Beauty Optional, and something cracked. She folded the paper and put it in the kitchen drawer. She took it out that evening and read it again. She put it away a second time. 3 days later, she wrote the letter. She did not write about herself the way women were supposed to write about themselves in those situations. She'd seen the advice columns, the careful instructions about appearing cheerful and capable and modest. She did not describe her figure or apologize for it. She did not manufacture a version of herself that might be easier to accept. She wrote the truth. My name is Eleanor Parker. I am 29 years old, and I live in Columbus, Ohio, where I keep the books for a mercantile and help my family as I am able. I am not a small woman, and I will not pretend otherwise, because I find that pretending takes up energy better spent elsewhere. I love books more than almost anything. I love a garden in the early morning before the heat comes up. I love feeding people, and I am good at it. I am not afraid of hard work, and I do not need luxury. I need honesty. I need to feel useful. I need to stop feeling like my life is something happening to someone else while I watch through a window. If you wrote that advertisement sincerely, then I am writing this letter sincerely in return. I may not be what you expect, but I know how to build a home with my own 2 hands. She sealed it before she could talk herself out of it. She mailed it the next morning and told herself it didn't matter if he never wrote back. Caleb Whitmore got her letter on a Tuesday. He was at the trading post in Pine Hollow when Hank Deaver behind the counter slid it across to him with the rest of his mail, and Caleb tucked it into his coat pocket without looking at it and rode the 4 miles back up to his property with the letter pressing against his chest the whole way. He had received 11 letters in response to the advertisement. He had answered none of them. The first 3 had been cheerful and careful, written by women who described themselves in the language of advertisements, pleasant disposition, accomplished in domestic arts, willing to relocate. They read like job applications from people who had no idea what they were applying for. He'd put those aside. 2 more had arrived together, both from the same town in Kansas, and both so similar in tone that he wondered if the women had written them at the same table. One had included a small portrait. He'd looked at it for a long time and felt nothing except tired. The others ranged from hopeful to suspicious, to one that was clearly written by someone's mother on the daughter's behalf, the daughter's voice nowhere present in it at all. He hadn't written back. His neighbor Tom Greer had asked him twice whether he was serious about the whole business, or just lonely enough to do something foolish, and Caleb had answered both times with silence, which Tom had learned over 20 years of neighboring to accept as a full sentence. Caleb was not a man who explained himself. He had been born in Kentucky, raised in Tennessee, come west at 19, with nothing but his father's rifle, and a stubbornness that passed for courage when he was young. He'd worked cattle drives for 6 years, learned carpentry from a German man in Denver, who'd been the finest craftsman Caleb had ever seen, and eventually settled in the mountains above Pine Hollow, because the mountains didn't require him to talk to anyone, and the work never ran out. He'd been married once. Her name was Clara. She'd been gentle and funny and afraid of thunderstorms, and she had died of fever in the winter of 1875, along with the child she'd been carrying. And Caleb had buried them both in the frozen ground on the hill behind his cabin, and spent the next 2 years making sure he never got close enough to anyone to feel that particular kind of ruin again. He was good at alone. He understood alone. Alone didn't ask anything of him except to keep working, keep quiet, keep moving. But the previous autumn, he'd finished the main house, the one he'd expanded from the original cabin. 3 proper rooms, now a real kitchen, a fireplace that drew clean. And he'd stood on the porch looking at the second building site he'd cleared and realized he'd started framing the walls without deciding to. His hands had just started. He'd stood there in the cold looking at what his hands had begun and understood something that he didn't have the language for, except to say that he was tired of alone, in a way that surviving alone didn't fix. He'd placed the advertisement 3 days later. Now he sat at his table with Eleanor Parker's letter in front of him and read it once slowly, and then sat still for a long time. I find that pretending takes up energy better spent elsewhere. He read that line again. Then he picked up his pen. They wrote to each other for 4 months. Eleanor had not expected to feel anything. She had sent the letter as an experiment in courage. She told herself a test of whether she was capable of wanting something out loud. She had not expected him to answer. When the answer came, 2 pages small, handwriting precise and plain, and completely without performance. She had read it standing in her kitchen, still wearing her coat and gloves, because she hadn't even gotten as far as hanging them up. He wrote the way she imagined a man like that would speak, directly, without waste. He described the mountains with the brevity of someone who had lived in them long enough to stop needing to explain them to himself. He described his work. He mentioned Clara not at length, just enough the way a person mentions a scar when it's relevant to the conversation. He said he'd built most of his property himself, and was adding to it, and that the winters were serious and required a particular disposition to endure. He did not ask her what she looked like. That fact sat with Eleanor for 3 days before she understood why it mattered so much to her. Every other man who had ever shown any interest, and there had been a few scattered across her 20s, like rare and somewhat puzzling weather events, had either ignored her appearance and then had it occur to them later loudly, in a way that ended things, or had made clear from the beginning that her appearance was a problem they were generously overlooking, which was in many ways worse. Caleb Whitmore wrote 4 letters before he asked her a single personal question. And that question was whether she'd read Moby Dick because he'd recently acquired a copy and found it either brilliant or exhausting. He couldn't settle which. She wrote back that it was both simultaneously, and that was probably the point. He wrote back that he thought she was probably right. She started reading his letters at the kitchen table and then found herself still sitting there an hour later when her coffee had gone cold. Not because the letters were long, they weren't, but because she kept stopping to think about what he'd said. Her sister Margaret caught her smiling at one of them in February, and made a sound Eleanor had not heard directed at her in years. "Eleanor Parker," Margaret said. "Is that a man's handwriting?" "It's correspondence," Eleanor said. "It's a smile," Margaret said. "You have a smile on your face. Who is he?" Eleanor folded the letter. "He's nobody yet. Nobody doesn't make you smile like that." Eleanor put the letter in her apron pocket and changed the subject. But that evening, she sat alone in her room and let herself feel cautiously the thing she had been keeping at a careful distance. She was interested, not just in the letters, in him, in the person who had written beauty optional and meant it the way she was beginning to suspect he meant it, not as a concession, not as a polite lowering of standards, but as an honest statement of what he actually believed mattered. She was terrified. She wrote to him about that too eventually. Not in those words. But she wrote about the women who had laughed at her in the dry goods store the previous week, and the way she'd stood there in the bread aisle and looked at the shelf and kept very still until they passed. And how she'd been doing that, her whole life, going still, making herself smaller, waiting for the judgment to pass, and how she was exhausted by it in a way she couldn't explain to most people, because most people would tell her to simply pay it no mind. His response arrived 10 days later. "I know something about making yourself smaller to avoid a thing. I did it with people after Clara died. Stopped talking much. Stopped coming down to town except when I had to. Easier than explaining. Easier than watching people's faces while they tried to figure out what you needed. The mountains don't look at you like that. But I notice the mountains also don't say anything back. I reckon that's a particular kind of lonely a person can get used to without meaning to." Eleanor read that and felt something move in her chest. She wrote back. He wrote back. March became April. In April, he asked her to come. The conversation with her family was not easy. Her father sat at the head of the table and looked at her the way he looked at business decisions he'd already half decided against. Her mother folded and refolded her napkin. Margaret was quiet in the way that meant she was choosing her words. "Colorado Territory," her father said. "Outside a town called Pine Hollow," Eleanor said. "In the mountains. You've never met this man." "I know him from his letters." "You know what he chooses to put in letters," her father said. "That's not the same thing." "No," Eleanor said. "But it's something." Her mother said, "Eleanor, be reasonable. What if he's not what you expect?" "What if I'm not what he expects?" Eleanor said, and there was an edge in her voice she hadn't planned, a truth coming up from somewhere underneath the careful patience she usually maintained. "Has anyone at this table considered that he might see me and decide I'm not what he had in mind? Has anyone considered that I already know how that feels and I've decided it's worth the risk anyway?" Silence around the table. Her father cleared his throat. "It's not safe." "Father?" Eleanor looked at him directly the way she didn't usually permit herself. "I have been safe my entire life. I have been sensible and careful, and I have not asked for anything that anyone thought was unreasonable. I am asking for this." Margaret said quietly. "What if you're disappointed?" "Then I'll come home," Eleanor said. "But I'd rather be disappointed by something real than comforted by the same nothing I already have." Nobody had an answer for that. She left for Colorado on the 3rd of May. The train took 4 days. Eleanor had a window seat and a book she barely read, and enough money saved to make the return journey if she needed to. She had packed her good dress, her practical dress, her sturdy boots, her best apron, every book she couldn't bear to leave behind, her mother's recipe cards, a small photograph of her family, and a cast-iron pot she'd owned for 11 years that she considered essential to any functioning kitchen. She watched Ohio become Indiana, become Illinois, become the long, flat push of Kansas, and then the land began to rise and change color, and the air coming through the window gap smelled different, thinner, sharper, like something had been scraped clean. She was terrified for most of it. Not of him exactly. She had read enough of his letters to have assembled a portrait of him that felt real to her. a quiet man, careful and contained, who had been through something that had changed the shape of him, who was honest because dishonesty required more energy than he wanted to spend. She wasn't afraid of that man. She was afraid of the moment she stepped off the train. She was afraid of his face when he saw her. She had not told him. She had not described herself in those 4 months of letters. She had written around it the way she always wrote around it, not lying exactly, just not addressing it. And now she was 4 days into a train ride toward a man who had built a house for her, and she was sitting with the question of whether she had been dishonest by omission or simply protecting herself from a pain she wasn't ready for. She thought about it for 2 days, and then she wrote him a letter on the train. "I am coming as promised, and I will be there on the 12th. I want to tell you something that I should have said before. I am not a small woman. I am large in the way that women are not supposed to be, and I have spent my entire life having that be the first thing people see when they look at me. I understand if that changes things. I would rather you know before I arrive than have you standing on a platform trying to find a polite way to manage your disappointment. If this changes your mind, please send word to the Pine Hollow station before the 12th, and I will not get off the train." She mailed it from a station in Kansas. She spent 2 days not knowing whether a return letter would be waiting for her. Nothing was waiting for her at the station stops in Colorado. She arrived in Pine Hollow, not knowing. The platform was crowded for a Thursday. Eleanor understood immediately that it was crowded because of her. Word had gotten around the way word always got around in small towns that Caleb Whitmore's mail-order bride was arriving on the noon train. People had come to see. They stood in clusters along the platform edge, some with actual pretense of other business, some not bothering. She could feel the looking before she even got her bag from the car. She stepped down from the train and stood up straight. She heard someone, a woman somewhere to her right, say it without lowering her voice. Lord, no wonder Ohio sent her away. Laughter from somewhere nearby. Quick, sharp, the kind that was meant to be heard. Eleanor did not look in that direction. She set her suitcase down beside her and held her bag against her side and looked down the platform, and she thought very clearly, very deliberately, "You have come 4 days on a train. You can stand on a platform for 30 seconds. She stood. Then she saw him. She knew him before she knew how she knew him. He was standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her the way people only look at something they have been waiting for, with a concentration so complete it had no room in it for anything else. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from actual work, wide through the chest and shoulders, weathered in the face. He was not a handsome man in any easy way, but there was something in his face, the steadiness of it, the fact that it was not performing anything at all, that she recognized from his letters. He walked toward her. The platform had gone somewhat quieter. He stopped in front of her and he looked at her. Not the rapid assessment, not the flicker of surprise quickly covered, not the careful, neutral expression of a man managing his reaction. Just looked at her the way she had looked at his letter the first time she'd read it, like something was registering that he was taking his time with. "Eleanor Parker," he said. "Caleb Whitmore," she said. "You made it." "I did." He reached down and picked up her suitcase, the heavy one with the books and the cast-iron pot, without appearing to notice the weight of it. "You hungry? I've got the wagon." She stared at him. "That's all you're going to say." Caleb settled her suitcase under his arm. "I figured you'd want to eat something before I started talking your ear off." He glanced at her once brief, and there was something almost dry in it, something that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. "You look like you've had a long 4 days." Yes," she said. "I have. There's a place in town that does a decent meal before we head up." He turned toward the far end of the platform. "You can tell me about the train." Eleanor stood still for 2 seconds. Behind her, she heard the murmuring pick up again, the town commentary resuming the judgments being delivered between people who had come to see something and were still deciding what they'd seen. She picked up her bag and followed him. His name in Pine Hollow carried a particular kind of weight, She understood that within the first 20 minutes in the small restaurant near the station where the woman who brought their food looked at Eleanor with an assessment so thorough and so rapid that Eleanor felt like she'd been read like an inventory list. The woman said nothing unkind. She was simply precise about what she observed, in the way that some women have of making their disapproval architectural, built into the very structure of how they move and where they look. Caleb didn't appear to notice. He asked Eleanor about her family. He asked about the mercantile, the bookkeeping, the kind of work she'd done. He listened the way she'd suspected he listened from his letters, completely, without the slightly glazed look of a man waiting for his turn to talk. He asked a follow-up question about something she said regarding her father's business that told her he'd actually been paying attention to something she'd mentioned in a letter 3 months earlier. "You remembered that," she said. "I read your letters more than once," he said simply. She looked at her coffee. "Did you get mine?" she asked. "The one I sent from Kansas." "Got it this morning," he said. She waited. "And," she said when he didn't continue. Caleb set down his cup. "And you're here. I'm here. The food's decent. We should probably eat it." "Caleb." He looked at her directly. "Eleanor, I placed that advertisement because I wanted to find a woman of honest character who could build a life in hard country. You wrote me the most honest letter I received. Everything you've said in 4 months has been consistent with who you are sitting across from me right now." He paused. "What exactly did you think I was going to do? I thought you might be—" She stopped. She tried again. "I thought there might be a difference between knowing something in a letter and seeing it," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant noise continued around them, cutlery and conversation, the sounds of ordinary life carrying on. "There's always a difference," he said, "between a letter and a person. That's true of everyone. You're not what I exactly pictured." He picked up his cup again. "Neither am I, I'd wager." "You're not," she said before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression. Still not quite a smile, but closer. "What did you picture?" "Someone more." She searched. "I'm not sure. You write like someone older." "I've had an older life than my age accounts for," he said. She thought of Clara. She thought of the hill behind his cabin and what he'd buried there in the frozen ground. She did not say anything about it. "The house is finished," he said after a moment. "Or mostly. The kitchen shelves still need a back rail. I ran out of time." "I can help with that." He looked at her. "Can you—" "I've built shelves before," she said. "My father's shop. You use a level usually." "Then yes, I can help." He nodded once, the way she was beginning to understand. He nodded when something satisfied him, not emphatic, just settled. They finished their meal. "Tongi." The wagon ride up the mountain took nearly an hour. They didn't talk for the first part of it, not uncomfortably, just in the way that two people who have been corresponding for months sometimes need a moment to adjust to the actual physical fact of each other before the conversation can resume on its proper footing. Eleanor watched the mountains move around them as they climbed. She had seen drawings, she had read descriptions, but the actual presence of them was something else entirely, not the backdrop she'd imagined, but something more like a presence, something that existed on a scale that made human concerns feel simultaneously trivial and more urgent. "It's different from what I expected," she said. "The mountains, yes. Most people say that." He kept his eyes on the road, which required attention. "Some people are frightened by them." "Are you—" "Used to be," he said. "When I first came up here, I thought they were indifferent. Just big and indifferent. Took me a while to understand that indifferent isn't the same as hostile. They don't care one way or another. That's actually easier to live with than people who have an opinion." Eleanor thought about that. "Is that why you stayed? Because they don't have opinions?" "Partly." A pause. "And partly because I'm good at the work up here. The hunting, the carpentry. I understand what the land needs, and it understands what I need, most of the time." "What does it need?" "Respect mostly, same as anything." She turned that over. "And what do you need?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Same thing, I reckon." They came around a bend and she saw the property. She had imagined it from his letters. She'd assembled it in her mind over 4 months, the original cabin, the cleared land, the building site he'd described. She had a picture of it. The picture was insufficient. The main house, the one he'd expanded, sat solid and square against the mountain, with the kind of permanence that came from work done slowly and done right. The windows were properly framed. The porch roof was level. The firewood was stacked with a precision that told you something about the man who'd stacked it. And beside it, close but separate, stood the other house. Her house. The one he'd built before he knew who she was. It was smaller than the main house, but it wasn't small. It had a covered porch with 2 wooden chairs that faced out toward the valley. It had window boxes that were empty now, but clearly intended for something. The front door was painted a dark green. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Caleb climbed down from the wagon and tied the horse without looking at her, giving her the moment, and she understood that it was intentional, that he was a man who understood when silence needed to be allowed to run its course. She climbed down herself. She walked to the porch and put her hand on the back of one of the chairs. The wood was smooth from sanding, the kind of finish that took a long time. She looked at the valley below, the long fall of it, the way the light was going. "You built this before I wrote to you," she said. "Before I heard from you," he said. "Started it in the fall." "Why?" He came to stand beside her, not close, just beside. "Because I'd decided to try. And it seemed wrong to invite someone into my house and call it theirs. Seemed right to build them their own." She looked at the chair under her hand. "You built 2 chairs." "Figured on visiting," he said, "if she wanted company." Eleanor's throat was doing something inconvenient. She pressed her lips together and looked at the valley until it passed. "The kitchen shelves," she said finally. "You said they need a back rail." "Back rail and a leveling on the second shelf," he said. "It's off by about 1/4 inch." "That's enough to roll a jar," she said. "That's what I thought." She took her hand off the chair and turned to face him. "You'll need to show me where the tools are." He looked at her for a moment, and in that moment, she could see all 4 months of letters in his face, all the careful honesty they'd exchanged, all the trust built slowly in the ordinary language of 2 people trying to tell each other the truth about themselves. "I'll show you whatever you need," he said. He picked up her suitcase from the wagon, all that weight, the books and the cast-iron pot and the 11 years of her practical life, and carried it toward the door of the house he had built for a woman he'd never met. Eleanor Parker followed him in. Behind them, down the mountain, Pine Hollow was already talking. And up here in the clean, sharp air above the valley, a woman who had spent her entire life being looked past was standing in a house built specifically for her, and she was already making note of where she'd plant the garden come spring. The first morning, Eleanor burned the biscuits. Not badly, not inedibly, but the bottoms were darker than they should have been, and she stood in the kitchen of her new house holding the pan and looking at them with an expression that had nothing to do with biscuits and everything to do with every voice she'd carried 4 days on a train from Ohio. She heard the door. Caleb came in from outside, smelled the air, and looked at the pan in her hands. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pulled out a chair, sat down, and reached for one of the biscuits. "Don't," she said. "They're burned." "Bottoms are dark," he said. "That's different." He bit into it. He chewed. He swallowed. "Your oven runs hot on the left side. I should have told you that before you started." Eleanor stared at him. "I've been meaning to adjust the damper on that side for 2 weeks," he said, reaching for a second biscuit. "Never got around to it. That's my fault, not yours." She set the pan down slowly. "You're eating them anyway." "They're good biscuits," he said. "Just need the damper adjusted." She sat down across from him. She didn't say what she was thinking, which was that she'd spent 29 years having her failures treated as evidence of a larger conclusion about her, and this man was sitting at her kitchen table, eating a burned biscuit, and blaming his own damper. She didn't say it, because she didn't have the language for it yet. For what it felt like to have a mistake treated as a mechanical problem with a mechanical solution, instead of proof of something she already feared about herself. She just sat down and reached for a biscuit and ate it. It was too dark on the bottom. The rest of it was fine. That was the first morning. The second morning, she found the damper and adjusted it herself. The biscuits came out even all the way around. She left 3 of them on the porch rail of the main house before Caleb was up, and when she came back, past an hour later, they were gone. She allowed herself to feel something small and warm about that, and then she went back to work. Work was not a thing she lacked in Pine Hollow. The house Caleb had built for her was a good house. Solid structure, sound roof, enough room, but it was a house built by a man who lived alone and thought in those terms. The kitchen was functional, but organized without logic. The shelves spaced for general storage rather than the actual rhythm of cooking. The bedroom had a fine bed and nothing else. The room she'd begun thinking of as her library had 4 walls and a window, and the understanding that she would fill it herself. She started with what she had. Her books went onto the main shelf in the order she wanted them, not alphabetical, not by subject, but by the way she read by conversation, so that the book you finished led naturally to the one that would answer the question it left you with. Her mother's recipe cards went into a tin on the kitchen counter. The cast iron pot went on the stove where it belonged. She was rearranging the kitchen shelves on the 3rd day Caleb had fixed the leveling issue the evening before, working quietly beside her while she held the level and told him when it was right when she heard footsteps on her porch and looked up to find a woman standing in her open doorway. The woman was perhaps 50, lean and sharp-featured, with the particular confidence of someone who had been the authority in a room for a long time and had stopped questioning whether that was earned. She looked at Eleanor the way Eleanor was becoming accustomed to being looked at in Pine Hollow, with an assessment that started at the general and moved to the specific, and didn't much like what it found in either direction. "You're the bride," the woman said. "I'm Eleanor Parker," Eleanor said. "And you are Ruth Calhoun. My husband owns the feed store." A pause in which the woman looked around the kitchen with the expression of someone cataloging what they saw. "I wanted to see how you were settling in." "Kindly of you," Eleanor said. She came down from the step stool she'd been using to reach the upper shelves. "Can I offer you coffee? I won't stay." Ruth Calhoun's eyes moved from the reorganized shelves to Eleanor's face. "I'll say what I came to say." "All right." "Caleb Whitmore is a good man," Ruth said. "He's had a hard time, and he doesn't ask for help, and this town respects him even when he doesn't give us much cause to show it. What he did building that house, sending off for someone—" She stopped. Tried again. "People here were concerned about his judgment, about whether he'd lost his mind," Eleanor said pleasantly. Ruth blinked just slightly. "His methods were unusual." "They were," Eleanor agreed. "Coffee. I said I wouldn't stay." "Then say the rest of what you came to say, Mrs. Calhoun, and we'll both get back to our mornings." There it was. Something flickered across Ruth Calhoun's face that Eleanor couldn't quite name. Not quite respect. More like recalibration. "The winters up here are serious," Ruth said. "They're not like Ohio winters. People who aren't prepared. People who come thinking it'll be one thing and find it's another, they don't last. Caleb doesn't need another loss." The word landed the way it was meant to. Eleanor kept her face steady. "I appreciate your concern for him," Eleanor said. "I'll pass it along that you came by." She picked up her level from the counter. "You're welcome here anytime, Mrs. Calhoun." Genuinely. Ruth Calhoun left. Eleanor set the level down on the shelf and pressed both palms flat on the counter and breathed in once deliberately. Then she climbed back up the step stool and went back to work. She was going to need to be very good at this, at holding herself steady while people delivered their verdicts. She'd had practice. She had 29 years of practice. She just hadn't expected to need it here, too. Caleb noticed. He didn't say so directly. That wasn't how he operated. But she was beginning to map his patterns the way he was present without announcing his presence. the way he observed without making observation feel like surveillance. On the fourth afternoon, she came back from a walk down toward the tree line and found a book on her porch rail. No note. Just a book, a copy of David Copperfield, with a worn cover, and a small piece of folded paper tucked into the first chapter. She opened the paper. Found this in Denver last year. Thought you might not have it. See, she had read David Copperfield twice. She did not have this particular edition. She sat in the chair on her porch and read the first chapter and felt a complicated mix of things that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. That evening she knocked on his door. "I have it," she said when he answered. He leaned in the doorframe. "Have what?" She held up the book. "David Copperfield. I've read it twice." He didn't look embarrassed exactly. Just caught. "I'll take it back. Find you something else." "No," she said. "I want this one. Because it's yours. Because you had it in Denver." She paused. "But I thought you should know you're not as subtle as you think you are." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, but closer than before. "What do you mean?" "The biscuit damper," she said. "The shelf leveling. The book." He was quiet. "You're looking after me," she said. "You don't want me to feel lost, so you keep giving me problems with solutions. Things I can fix. Things I can do right." The almost smile faded into something more serious. He looked at her for a long moment. "Is that wrong?" he said. She thought about it honestly, which was a thing she appreciated, that he'd made possible the space for honesty. "No," she said finally. "It's not wrong. It just means you're paying attention, and I wanted you to know that I've noticed." "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She went back to her porch and her book, and she sat in the dark Colorado evening, and understood that something was growing between them that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't yet anything else. It was something intermediate, something careful and real, built the same way he built everything, slowly and with attention to what would last. The first time Pine Hollow came for her in force, it was at the general store. She had been in the territory for 11 days. She had figured out the oven damper and the well rope and the particular way the front door of her house needed to be lifted slightly while turned to open without catching. She was beginning to feel competent. Not comfortable competent. There was a difference, and she knew it. She needed flour and salt and lamp oil, and Caleb had given her directions, and she had walked the 4 miles down the mountain with a clear list and the specific intention of conducting a simple errand, like a person who belonged in the place she was conducting it. The general store smelled like pine resin and coffee and dried goods, and the man behind the counter, wide and thick-necked with a mustache that he clearly considered his best feature, looked up when she came in, and then looked away, and then looked back in the way that had a specific meaning Eleanor had learned to read over 2 decades. "Help you," he said, not helping. "Flour," she said. 20 pounds. Salt. A can of lamp oil. He started pulling the items without enthusiasm. There were 2 other women in the store. Eleanor heard them before she placed them. Heard the specific lowering of a conversation that wasn't actually a lowering, more of a redirecting, so that the words were just audible enough. Can't imagine what he was thinking. She'll be gone before the first snow. Poor Caleb, really, when you think about it. Eleanor kept her eyes on the counter. She gave the man her list price, which she'd calculated before she left the house. He gave her back her change without looking at her. She picked up her goods. She was at the door when one of the women said it clearly enough that there was no possible interpretation except intention. "I give her 6 weeks." Eleanor stopped. The store went quiet. She turned around slowly. The woman who'd spoken was perhaps 40, with the look of someone who had decided long ago that her opinions constituted public service. She met Eleanor's eyes without flinching, which told Eleanor she'd expected to be met and had prepared for it. 6 weeks, Eleanor said clearly. The woman didn't look away. The mountains take it out of people who aren't suited for them. They do, Eleanor agreed. Good thing I didn't come here to suit anyone. She turned back to the door and walked out. She was 200 yards up the road before her hands stopped shaking, and she did not allow herself to stop walking because stopping felt like a concession she wasn't prepared to make. She walked all 4 miles back up the mountain with her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, and she set them on her kitchen counter, and she stood there in the good-smelling kitchen of the house that had been built for her, and she breathed carefully until she felt like herself again. Then she made dinner. She made it well. She made the kind of dinner that required focus, a proper stew, slow-cooked with biscuits that were level on the bottom and golden on top, and came off the pan clean. She made enough for 2, and when Caleb came to her door that evening, she put a bowl in front of him before he could say anything. He sat down. He tasted it. "Good," he said. "I went to the general store today," she said. He looked up. "It went as expected," she said. He set his spoon down. "Morrison give you trouble?" The man behind the counter, no. He was no. She wrapped her hands around her own bowl. "There were some women with opinions." Caleb was quiet. "I handled it," she said. "I know you did," he said. "I just thought you should know it happened." He nodded. He picked up his spoon. "You want me to say something to anyone?" "No," she said immediately. "Absolutely not." "All right. I need to handle it myself," she said. "If you go speak on my behalf, it just confirms that I can't. And I can." He looked at her steadily. "I know you can." "Then we agree." "We do." They ate the rest of the stew without talking about it again, and Eleanor filed away the fact that he had asked, had offered, and had accepted her answer without argument. She filed it in the same careful place she'd been filing all the other things about Caleb Whitmore that she was not yet ready to examine directly. Tom Greer came around on the 12th day. Tom was Caleb's nearest neighbor, a broad, cheerful man with a red beard and a wife named Dottie, who apparently made the best apple butter in the territory according to Tom, who mentioned it 3 times in 15 minutes. He came ostensibly to return a borrowed chain hoist and stayed to drink coffee and look at Eleanor with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of a man who didn't have anything to hide, including his curiosity. "So you're the letter writer," he said. "I am," she said. "Caleb showed me the advertisement he placed," Tom said. "Back in the fall, I told him he'd lost his mind. A lot of people thought that. Well?" Tom wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I've been wrong about things before. Dottie reminds me of this regularly." He looked around the kitchen at the reorganized shelves, the recipe tin, the stacked clean dishes, the way the room had been arranged to actually function. "Caleb's place looked like a man's place before," he said. "This looks like a home." Eleanor felt something move through her chest. She kept her expression neutral. "He built it well," she said. "He built it for you," Tom said, as if this were self-evident, as if it didn't require any expansion. Then he looked at her directly. "You staying?" The question was more complex than it sounded, and they both knew it. Eleanor looked at him. "That's my intention," she said. Tom nodded once, satisfied. "Good. Then come to supper Sunday. Dottie's been asking, and she won't stop until I bring an answer." Eleanor accepted. After Tom left, she stood on her porch and looked out at the valley and thought about what he'd said. "This looks like a home." She had not allowed herself to use that word yet. It was too large, too much to claim, but it had landed in her. She was still thinking about it when Caleb came around the corner of the main house and stopped when he saw her standing on the porch. "Tom stay long?" he asked. "He mentioned Dottie's apple butter several times. He always does." Caleb came up to the porch rail. "She invited you to Sunday supper." Tom did. On her behalf. Same thing. He leaned against the rail with his arms crossed, looking out at what she was looking at. The quiet they'd established between them was different from the first day quiet. It was starting to have shape to it, to have room for things that didn't need to be said. "Mrs. Calhoun came by on my second day," Eleanor said. "I know." She looked at him. "You know, Ruth tells me things. Always has." His jaw set briefly the way it did when something bothered him that he wasn't going to spend much time on. She had no business saying what she said. How do you know what she said? Because I know Ruth. He turned his head to look at her. What she said about loss. She was trying to protect you, Eleanor said, and meant it. She was telling you that she's already decided what you are, Caleb said. Which is different. Eleanor was quiet. You're not something I need protection from, he said. You're someone I asked to come here. She looked back at the valley. Her throat was doing the inconvenient thing again. You asked a stranger. I asked you, he said. There's a difference. She turned that over for a moment. The distinction that he'd asked her specifically the person who'd written those letters, and not an abstraction of a person, settled into her in a way that she wasn't going to be able to dislodge easily. I should have told you earlier, she said, about how I look. I should have said it plainly in the first letter. He was quiet for a beat. Why? Because it changes things. It changes how It changes how small people see you, he said. That's not the same as changing things. A pause. Did it change anything I said to you? She thought about the biscuit damper, the shelf leveling, the book, the way he'd asked her at dinner whether he should say something and had accepted her no without a syllable of protest. No, she said. Then. He pushed off the rail. Sunday supper at Tom and Dottie's. You'll like Dottie. He went back to the main house. Eleanor stood on her porch for another few minutes, and the valley went on being the valley below, her enormous and indifferent, and not hostile, and she was starting to understand what he meant by that. The Sunday supper was the thing that broke Pine Hollow open. Not immediately, not dramatically, but Eleanor had been keeping books long enough to know that most things that appear to happen suddenly have actually been accumulating for a while, and what looked like a single event was almost always a ledger reaching its balance. Dottie Greer was small and round, and had the kind of energy that made you feel warm, simply by proximity, the way a good stove throws heat into the whole room. She had Eleanor's coat off and a cup of something hot in her hand before she'd gotten fully through the door, and she talked continuously, without it being exhausting, the way some people can talk, because what they say is actually worth listening to. The apple butter was exactly as advertised. There were 4 other couples at the supper, neighbors, all of them with varying degrees of familiarity with Caleb and varying degrees of curiosity about Eleanor. She felt them taking their measure of her throughout the meal. She was accustomed to that. She answered questions directly and without elaboration, and asked questions in return because she'd learned that people who believe they're being listened to forget to keep looking for things to criticize. She was helping Dottie clear after the meal. The 2 men who'd offered had been cheerfully redirected to the parlor when she heard it. She wasn't meant to hear it. The man who said it was in the side room off the kitchen, voice lowered, but not lowered enough for the particular acoustics of Dottie Greer's house. Eleanor didn't know his name yet. His voice was familiar in the confident way of men who believed their opinions required no lowering. Don't know what Whitmore was thinking, honestly. She's not, look at her. Ruth Calhoun was right, it's not going to last. And then it's Caleb who gets to pick up the pieces. Dottie's hands stilled on the dish she was washing. Their eyes met. Dottie looked at Eleanor with an expression of such direct and uncomplicated fury on her behalf that Eleanor's chest caught. Don't, Eleanor said quietly. Pete Hadley needs his ears pinned back, Dottie said at the same volume. He's not wrong that it's an unusual situation, Eleanor said, and heard her own voice come out steady, which surprised her somewhat. He's wrong about every single thing he just said. Dottie dried her hands. And he knows better. He knows Caleb. He knows what Caleb's been through, and to stand in this house and say, Dottie. Eleanor touched her arm briefly. I've been hearing some version of that my whole life. What's different up here isn't that people won't say it. What's different is... She stopped. Found the word. What's different is Caleb. Dottie looked at her for a long moment. Something in her expression shifted the fury, settling into something softer and more complex. You like him, Dottie said. He's... Eleanor started and stopped again. He built me a house, before he knew me. He built me a house and 2 chairs for the porch and adjusted my oven damper and hasn't said a single word that made me feel like I needed to apologize for standing in a room." Dottie was very quiet. "So, yes," Eleanor said. "I like him." Dottie picked up the next dish and they washed together in silence for a moment. "He hasn't smiled like that in 7 years," Dottie said finally very quietly. Eleanor kept her eyes on the dish in her hands. "Like what?" "Like he smiled when you walked in tonight." Dottie passed her the dish to dry. "He didn't even know he was doing it." Eleanor dried the dish. She placed it on the stack. She reached for the next one. In the parlor, she could hear Caleb's voice, that low, even voice that she could pick out of a room's noise now without trying answering something Tom had said. And she thought about what Dottie had said, and she thought about what she'd said in return, and she let herself feel very carefully and very deliberately how true it was. She liked him. She more than liked him. And that was where the real danger started. He found her in the library 3 nights after the Greer supper. She'd been awake since 2 in the morning, with the particular insomnia of someone who has too many thoughts and not enough resolution on any of them. She'd lit the lamp and pulled out her ledger. Not any official ledger, just the one she kept for herself, where she did figures to calm down, because numbers behaved in ways that feelings didn't. And she was working through some calculations about the kitchen garden she intended to put in, come spring, when she heard the knock on her door. She opened it. Caleb stood there in the dark with his coat on over what he'd clearly slept in, which was to say not much. He looked at the lamp behind her. "Saw the light," he said. "I couldn't sleep." He looked at her for a beat. "You all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "Come in or don't, but don't let the cold in." He came in. He sat at her table without being invited and without looking like he needed to be, which was the kind of ease that normally took months to establish, and Eleanor understood with sudden clarity that they had established it somehow in the odd compressed intimacy of the letters and the 2 weeks of proximate solitude. She put the kettle on. "What were you doing up?" she asked. "Heard the coyotes," he said. "Got up to check the stock. Saw your light." "The coyotes kept you up." "No." A pause. "I don't sleep much in general." She glanced at him. He was looking at her ledger on the table with the expression of someone who hadn't meant to look but did. She pushed it toward him. "Kitchen garden projections," she said. "Spring planting. I'm trying to figure out how much to put in the ground the first season to be practical without overcommitting before I know the soil." He pulled the ledger toward him and looked at the figures. Something shifted in his face. "You know what you're doing with numbers." "I've kept books since I was 17, she said. He traced 1 row of figures. "These are good calculations. Conservative. Smart for a first year." She poured the water for the tea and brought 2 cups to the table without asking if he wanted one. He wrapped his hands around the cup without comment. "I need to ask you something," she said. He looked up. "The south-facing slope below the house," she said. "Is that your property?" "Yes." "Could I use part of it for the garden? The light's better there than the flat section beside the house." He said yes before she'd finished the sentence. She noted that. "I'd want to do the work myself," she said. "The turning and the planting. I'll need help with the fence posts because the ground up here is harder than Ohio ground, but the rest I can manage." "I'll do the fence posts," he said. "I'll help." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He was quiet. Then, "All right." They sat at the table with their tea for a long time without talking, and Eleanor thought about what Dottie had said and what she'd said back, and she looked at Caleb Whitmore sitting at her kitchen table at 2 in the morning with his coat on over his sleep clothes, and she thought about how none of this had been in any plan she'd ever made for herself and how it had turned out to be better than the plans. Then he said out of nowhere in the quiet, "Clara used to say I worked instead of grieved." Eleanor went still. He was looking at the table, not at her, at the table at the cup. "She said I built things when I couldn't fix things. That when I didn't know how to make something right, I would go make something else right instead. A pause. She was right. I built most of the main house after she died. Worked for 2 solid years. Then I ran out of things to build. And then you built mine, Eleanor said. He looked up. You couldn't fix what happened, she said. So you built something. He held her eyes for a long moment. That's one way to see it, he said. Is it wrong? He thought about it honestly the way she'd noticed he always did. No, he said. It's not wrong. Another pause. But it's not all of it. What's the rest of it? He wrapped both hands around his cup. The rest of it is that I read your letter and thought, here is a person who knows what it's like to be in a room and be invisible. And I know what that's like, and I thought maybe 2 people who know what that's like could... He stopped. Could what she said very quietly. Could maybe see each other, he said. The kitchen was quiet. The lamp threw its warm circle. Outside, the mountains were doing what mountains do at 2 in the morning, which is to say, holding everything in a stillness that made the rest of the world feel very far away. Eleanor looked at him across the table. I see you, she said. He held her gaze. I know, he said. I see you too. They finished their tea. He went back to the main house. She put the cups in the basin and turned off the lamp and lay in her bed in the dark, with her heart doing something complicated and certain, and she thought about invisible people seeing each other. And she thought about 2 chairs on a porch, and she thought about a man who built things when he couldn't fix things and had built her a home. She did not sleep for a long time, but it was a different kind of awake than the one she'd started the night with. It was the kind of awake that meant something was beginning. The fence posts went in on a Saturday. Caleb had marked the line the evening before, driving stakes into the frozen hard ground. At intervals, Eleanor had measured herself walking the slope with a rope and a stick, and the kind of methodical patience that Caleb had noticed about her from the beginning. The way she didn't rush, a calculation, didn't guess when she could measure, didn't assume when she could verify. He'd watched her from the main house porch, without meaning to watch, and then gone inside when he realized he'd been standing there for 10 minutes. Saturday morning she was already on the slope when he came out dressed in her heaviest coat and her sturdy boots, holding one end of the guide rope while she waited. You were going to start without me, he said. I was going to start on time, she said. There's a difference. He picked up the post driver without comment, and they worked down the line together. Eleanor holding each post plumb while Caleb drove it, and they fell into a rhythm that felt like it had been practiced longer than 3 weeks. Because it had. They'd been building a working rhythm since the first morning since the biscuit damper, and the shelf leveling building it in the small exchanges, and the 2 in the morning tea, and the way they'd learned to share silence without either of them needing to fill it. Tom Greer came by mid-morning apparently for no reason, and then stayed for 3 hours because he was that kind of man. He took over the post driver and sent Caleb to brace the corner posts, and told Eleanor she had the best eye for plumb he'd encountered in 20 years of fencing, which Eleanor accepted without false modesty because it was true, and she knew it was true, and she'd learned from watching Caleb that you could acknowledge a true thing without it being a boast. By the time the light started going, they had 3 sides of a solid fence, and Dottie Greer had appeared from somewhere around noon with a pot of something hot and a pan of cornbread, and they all ate standing up at the tailgate of Tom's wagon. And Eleanor stood in the cold air of the mountain slope with fence dirt on her coat and hot food in her hands and something in her chest that she was no longer trying to name at arm's length. She was happy. The word arrived plain and simple, and she let it stand. 3 days later, Ruth Calhoun came back. Eleanor was in the library sorting through a crate of books she'd ordered from Denver, a small extravagance she'd permitted herself, budgeted for, carefully told no one about, when she heard the knock. She answered it with a book still in her hand, and Ruth Calhoun on the other side looking less certain than she had the first time. Mrs. Calhoun, Eleanor said. I owe you an apology, Ruth said. Just like that. No preamble, no softening. The words delivered the way Ruth Calhoun apparently delivered everything, straight and without decoration. Eleanor was so surprised she simply stood back from the door. Ruth came in. She stood in the middle of the library room and looked at the shelves. Eleanor had gotten 3 more up since the first day, filled and organized. And something moved through her expression that was too complicated to read quickly. "My husband told me I was unfair to you," Ruth said. "He said I came here to warn you off and called it concern for Caleb, and that those two things weren't the same." "Your husband sounds like a perceptive man," Eleanor said. "He's an irritating man," Ruth said. "He's also usually right." She turned to face Eleanor directly. "I watched Caleb build that house, all through the fall, and I thought it was grief. Something to do. I thought he'd build it, and then what? Send off for someone, and then realize he'd been lonely and foolish, and we'd all have to watch him go through something else he'd have to survive alone." Eleanor set the book down on the nearest shelf. "I wasn't prepared for you," Ruth said. "What do you mean?" "I mean you're not what I was prepared for." Ruth's jaw tightened slightly, the expression of someone being precise about something difficult. "I expected someone desperate. Someone who'd made a poor choice because she had no better options. I came here that first day looking for evidence that I was right. And you told me to say my piece and get back to my mourning," Ruth said. "Nobody said that to me in 10 years. Eleanor looked at her. "I was rude to you," Eleanor said. "That morning. I was sharper than I needed to be." "No, you weren't," Ruth said. "You were exact." A pause. "I would have done the same." She looked at the shelves again. "Caleb smiled at dinner last week. Tom came home and told me. I haven't seen Caleb smile at dinner since—" She stopped. "Since Clara," Eleanor said quietly. Ruth looked at her with an expression that had finally cleared of everything defensive, everything pre-decided. "Since Clara," she confirmed. They stood in the library together for a moment. "I'll stay out of your way," Ruth said. "You don't have to do that either," Eleanor said. "You were trying to protect someone you care about. I understand that. I'd rather have people here who care about him than not." Ruth studied her for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I see the rest of the house?" Eleanor showed her the rest of the house. Ruth left 40 minutes later, and Eleanor stood on the porch and watched her go, and thought that Pine Hollow was more complicated than it had looked from the train platform, and that most things were more complicated than they looked from a distance, and that this was generally a fact worth knowing. The letter arrived on a Thursday in late June. It came in a bundle of mail that the supply rider left at the bottom of the mountain road twice a week, and Caleb brought it up with him when he came back from checking his trap lines in the north section. He handed Eleanor her portion. Without looking at it, he never looked at her mail, and went inside the main house, and Eleanor stood on her porch and sorted through what she had. She recognized her brother's handwriting before she turned the envelope over. Daniel wrote to her twice-a-year Christmas and her birthday brief. Dutiful letters, full of family news she was mostly glad to receive. It was not her birthday. It was not Christmas. She opened the letter on the porch. She read it once quickly, and then sat down in her chair and read it again. Their father was sick. Not the gradual kind of sick, the kind that announces itself politely and gives a family time to arrange itself. The sudden kind. The kind that arrived without warning and changed the arithmetic of a household overnight. Daniel's letter was careful, but Eleanor had kept her father's books long enough to read the numbers that weren't there, the ones Daniel was being careful not to write down. The store was struggling. Had been struggling. Daniel admitted for some time in the way that things struggled when the person who understood the books wasn't there to read them. She needed to come home. Not forever. Daniel hadn't said forever, had been careful about that, but for a time, to help, to do what Eleanor had always done, which was to see clearly and fix what could be fixed before it became unfixable. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. The valley spread out below her the way it had since the first day. The mountains did what mountains do. Around her, the small sounds of the property continued, a horse shifting in the paddock, the rhythm of Caleb working somewhere nearby, the wind through the pines that she'd stopped hearing consciously, the way you stopped hearing your own heartbeat. She was afraid. Not of going home, not of leaving exactly. She was afraid of what leaving meant. She was afraid that if she went back to Ohio, she would lose the thread of whatever this was, that she would go back to the life she'd been living before the letter to Colorado and not find her way out of it again. She was afraid that 400 miles of distance and whatever time it took would quietly unmake what had been carefully made here. She was also afraid of staying, of saying to her father and to Daniel and to her mother, "I have my own life now, tend to yours." She had never said that. She had never in 29 years said to her family, "I cannot come when you call because I am busy becoming someone." She did not know if she was capable of it. She sat with both fears for a while and noticed that they were different weights. Then she went and knocked on Caleb's door. He answered, still holding a plane he'd been using on a piece of trim work. She could smell the fresh wood shavings and looked at her face and put the plane down on the table beside the door without a word. "Come in," he said. She came in and sat at his table and laid the letter on it. He sat across from her and read it. She watched his face while he read the steadiness of it, the attention the way he finished, and then sat for a moment before he looked up. "How bad is the money situation?" he said. Daniel didn't say. "Daniel didn't say because he doesn't want to worry you," Caleb said. "What's your read from what he did say?" She appreciated that he went straight to the practical. "Bad enough that he wrote in June. Daniel is a man who likes to believe things will resolve themselves if he gives them enough time. If he wrote in June, it means he's run out of time to give." Caleb set the letter on the table. "How long would you need?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "It depends on how bad the books are. It could be a month, it could be 3. 3 months, he said. "Caleb, I'm not—" He stopped. Tried again, and she could see the effort it took, not to manage what he said, but to say it without the armor he usually wore over everything. "I'm not saying don't go. I'm not saying your family doesn't need you. I'm saying—" He looked at the letter on the table. 3 months is a long time. The words fell into the space between them and lay there. She looked at him. He was looking at the letter. His jaw was set the way it got when something was costing him. "Are you asking me not to go?" she said very quietly. He looked up. "No." The word immediate and certain. "No. I'm asking you—" He stopped again. The plain shavings on the table between them, the afternoon light through the window, his hands flat on the table. "I'm asking you to come back." She felt it move through her like a current. "I'm asking," he said, "because I want to be sure you know that you have something to come back to. That's all. I want you to know that this—" He made a small gesture that encompassed the table and the house and the slope outside the window where the fence posts stood in a straight line. "That this is here. That I'm here." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah, I'm coming back," she said. "I was never not going to come back." He held her eyes. "All right," he said. "I need to hear you say it means something," she said. "I need to not have to guess. I've spent my whole life guessing whether I matter to people, and I am too tired for it. So I need you to say it plainly." He was very still. "Eleanor." His voice was the quietest she'd heard it. "You matter." She nodded once. She looked at the table. She breathed in. "Then I'll go home," she said. "I'll fix what I can fix, and I'll come back." He picked up the letter and folded it and passed it back to her. "I'll drive you to the station." "I know you will." "When are you thinking—" "End of the week," she said. "I need to put the garden notes together for you. You'll need to water the starts while I'm gone. They're in the east-facing window of my kitchen, the ones in the tin cans. Don't let the soil dry completely, but don't overwater them either." Something shifted in his face. "Tin can seedlings," he said. "They need looking after." "I'll look after them," he said. She stood up. She picked up the letter. At the door, she paused. "2 chairs," she said without turning around. "What?" She turned. You built 2 chairs on that porch before you knew who was coming. You didn't build 1 chair and leave room for another. You built 2. I thought about that a lot the first week. She looked at him. I'm coming back to my chair. He held her eyes. It'll be there, he said. She left on a Friday. She left the tin can seedlings in the east window with written instructions that she put on the kitchen counter, weighted down with a jar covering soil moisture and light requirements, and the fact that the one on the far right was slower than the others and shouldn't be compared to them, but simply given a little extra patience. She did not cry at the station. She almost did when Caleb put her trunk in the baggage car and came back to where she stood on the platform, and she saw on his face the same thing she was working hard not to show on hers. He was contained about it. He always was. But she knew his face well enough now to read what was underneath the containment. He took her hand, not formally, not the careful gloved handshake of strangers. He just took her hand the way you take something you want to hold for a moment before it goes, and held it for 3 seconds and then let go. Right when you get there, he said. I will. And if it's bad, I'll tell you, she said. I won't spare you the numbers. Good. He stepped back. He put his hat back on. Eleanor. I know, she said. She boarded the train. She did not look back at the platform because she had learned from experience that looking back made things harder, and she needed to be clear-headed for what was coming. She found her seat, and she looked out the window at the mountains as the train began to move, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was leaving, and held it without flinching, because that was what you did with real things. Ohio took 4 days. Chug. Columbus was louder than she remembered, noisier, flatter. The air was different, softer, heavier, without the clean, cold sharpness that she'd stopped noticing she'd needed until she was breathing air that didn't have it. She took a hired carriage from the station, and the city pressed in on her in a way it never had before, and she understood that she had been changed by where she'd been, and that there was no going back to the version of herself who had mailed a letter to a mountain man and told herself it didn't matter if he wrote back. Her mother was at the door. Her mother looked smaller than Eleanor remembered. Her father was in the back room where he'd been since the episode, and her brother Daniel met her in the hall with the expression of a man who had been carrying something alone for too long and had been waiting for someone who knew how to carry. How bad, she said. Bad, he said. Show me the books. He showed her the books. It was bad, not unrecoverable. Eleanor went through 2 years of ledgers in one evening, and by midnight she had a clear picture, which was that her father had been making decisions based on optimism rather than arithmetic for the better part of 18 months. And the gap between those two things had grown into something that needed immediate and methodical attention. It could be fixed. She had fixed harder things, but it required someone who understood numbers to be present and applying them, and Daniel, who was a good and well-meaning man, did not understand numbers the way Eleanor did. She wrote to Caleb the next morning, I am here. The books are bad but not hopeless. I have a plan, and I think 3 months is probably accurate. My father is recovering slowly. Daniel is relieved I'm here in a way that makes me realize he has not had any help with this, and has been managing entirely alone, which is not his fault because nobody knew it was this bad except the books, and nobody was reading the books. I am reading them now. I am thinking about your seedlings, and hoping you remembered the one on the far right is slower than the others and needs patience. Right back. His letter came 10 days later. Books here are your domain, so I won't comment on your books except to say that if you say it's fixable, it's fixable. Your father should listen to you about money. In my experience, men who think they understand numbers usually understand them less than women who actually understand numbers. The one on the right is slower. I've been paying attention to it. The others are doing well. The garden fence is solid. Come back when you can. She read the last sentence 4 times. Come back when you can. Not come back soon, that would have been pressure. Not come back when you're done, that would have been impatience. Come back when you can. Which was an acknowledgement that she would come back and an understanding that she would come back on the terms that were right, and a trust in her judgment about when those terms were met. She folded the letter and put it in the tin beside her mother's recipe cards, which she had brought with her because she cooked even in Ohio, even in her mother's kitchen, because cooking was how she thought. She went back to the books. Her father called her into the back room on the second week. He was sitting up in bed, which the doctor had recently permitted, and he looked pale and diminished in the way illness made even large personalities look like something had been turned down. Eleanor sat in the chair beside him, and he looked at her for a long time without speaking. "I made a mess of it," he said. "You made some decisions that didn't work out," she said. "That's different, Eleanor." His voice tired but direct. "I made a mess of it. You can tell me plainly." She looked at him. "You made a mess of it," she said, "and I'm fixing it." Something in his face shifted. "You look different," he said. "I've been in Colorado." "That's not what I mean." He studied her. "You look settled. You look like a woman who lives somewhere." He paused. "Does he treat you well?" The mountain man. The phrase was so precisely how Daniel would have described Caleb in a letter that she almost smiled. "He treats me well." "Margaret said you sounded different when you wrote to her," her father said. "She said you sounded like someone who belonged somewhere." Eleanor thought about 2 chairs on a porch, about tin can seedlings in an east window, about a man who said, "Come back when you can," and meant exactly that. "I do," she said. "I belong somewhere." Her father nodded. He looked tired. He reached out and put his hand over hers briefly, the gesture of a man who had not been demonstrative enough and knew it and was trying to correct that before the time when correcting it was no longer possible. "Good," he said. "Good." She squeezed his hand. She went back to the books. The trouble arrived in the 3rd week. It had been there the whole time. She'd seen the edges of it in the ledgers, a column of payments that didn't correspond to any supplier she could identify in the business records going back 14 months. She'd flagged it and set it aside and worked around it while she addressed the more immediate problems, but it came to the front on a Wednesday when a man appeared at the store. She was alone. Daniel was at the bank. Her mother was with her father. The man was heavy-set, with a way of standing in a doorway that made the doorway feel smaller. He said his name was Aldrich. He said he was there about the account. "Which account?" Eleanor said. "The private account," Aldrich said. "The one your father's been maintaining with my employer." She looked at him. "What is your employer's name?" He smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "Your father knows the name." "My father is ill," she said. "You're speaking to me. Give me the name." He gave it. A man named Carver. A name that appeared in no supplier list, no business record, no correspondence she'd found, but it was in the ledger 14 months of payments, and now she understood what those payments were. "How much does he claim my father owes?" she said. The number Aldrich gave her was not the number in the ledger. It was more. Considerably more. She held her face completely steady. She had kept a clerk's face her entire professional life, the face of someone processing information without reacting to it, because reacting to it was expensive, and you wanted to understand the full shape of a thing before you showed anyone what you thought of it. "I'll need documentation," she said. "Written accounting of the debt, the original terms, and all payments received against it. Bring it on Friday." Aldrich looked at her the way men looked at women who asked for documentation when they expected women to be frightened by numbers. "Your father didn't ask for documentation." "My father is ill," she said again. "I manage this account now. Bring the documentation, or there won't be a meeting." He left. She sat down at the desk and put both hands flat on the ledger and breathed deliberately. Something very wrong had been done to her father. She didn't have the full shape of it yet, but she had enough. A private account. Payments that didn't appear in any legitimate business context. A debt that had somehow grown between the ledger and Aldrich's mouth. Her father had been paying something he didn't understand to someone who was counting on him not to ask questions. She understood. She picked up a pen. She started a new ledger page, and that evening She wrote to Caleb, not about the seedlings, not about the books in general, but about Aldrich and Carver and the numbers that didn't match. She wrote it all out precisely and plainly, the way she would have written a business letter. Except that the person she was writing to was not a business contact. He was the man who had built her a house and held her hand at a train station and told her she mattered. She wrote, "I don't know yet what it is exactly, but someone has been taking money from my father, and I think they've been very careful about how they did it. I'm going to find out what they took, and I'm going to find a way to make it right. I wanted you to know because I said I wouldn't spare you the numbers, and this is a number that matters." She sealed the letter. She looked at the new ledger page with Carver's name at the top and the column she was going to fill in. She had been quiet her whole life. She had been careful and contained, and she had made herself smaller, and she had waited in the bread aisle while women said things they meant to be heard. She had accepted verdicts. Not this one. This was her father's livelihood, and her mother's security, and Daniel's future, and 20 years of her family's work, and someone had put their hands in it and taken from it while counting on a sick man's confusion and a family's distraction. She opened the ledger. She picked up her pen. She was going to find every single number. Aldrich came back on Friday with documents. Eleanor had spent 2 days preparing for him. Not emotionally, she had set emotion to one side the way she set a tool down when it wasn't the right tool for the job. She had spent 2 days with ledgers. Her father's business ledgers, the private account, the payment history, the dates, the amounts, the intervals. She had built a complete picture of what had been taken when it had been taken, and what the original terms of the arrangement, if there had ever been legitimate original terms, might have looked like before someone began altering them. She understood what Carver had done. Her father had borrowed money. That much was real. 3 years ago, when a supply line had gone bad and the store had a difficult quarter, he had borrowed from a private lender rather than the bank because the bank had conditions he couldn't meet that season. The original debt was documented. The original terms were reasonable if steep. But 14 months ago, those terms had changed, not in any document her father had signed, but in Carver's accounting. Interest had been recalculated. Payments had been credited at amounts lower than what had actually been paid. The total owed had grown in Carver's ledger in a way that bore no relationship to the arithmetic. Her father was not a stupid man, but he was a man who trusted handshakes and who had been ill for 6 months, and who had a son who was good-hearted and hard-working and genuinely did not understand numbers the way his daughter did. Carver had been counting on all of that. Aldrich appeared at the store at 9 in the morning with a folder of papers and the same smile from the first visit, the one that expected compliance. He handed her the papers. She looked at them. She looked at him over the top of them. "Sit down," she said. He sat down. "I'm going to ask you some questions," she said, "and I'd like straight answers because it will save us both time." She opened the folder. "This first document shows my father's initial debt as $420. Do you agree that's the original principal?" Aldrich shifted in his chair. "That's what the record shows." "Good. This second document shows an interest rate of 8% annually. Do you agree with that figure? Those are the agreed terms." "They were," she said. "Now." She turned to her own ledger, which was sitting open on the desk. "At 8% annually on $420 over 31 months of payments." She turned the ledger to face him. "The balance should be here. That's what's owed, not the number you gave me on Wednesday." Aldrich looked at this figure. He did not say anything immediately. "The discrepancy," Eleanor said pleasantly, "is $163. Which coincidentally matches almost exactly the sum of 12 payment credits that appear in your employer's ledger at lower amounts than what my father's bank records show he actually paid." She folded her hands on the desk. "Would you like to explain that to me, or would you prefer to go back to Mr. Carver and let him explain it?" The smile was gone. "Mrs. Parker," she said. "Miss Parker, and you haven't answered the question." Aldrich stood up. He was a large man, and he stood up in a way that was intended to use that size, filling the space between them. "Your father agreed to these terms," he said, and his voice had changed harder now the pleasantness stripped off. Eleanor did not move back from her chair. She had been in rooms with men who used their size as an argument, and she had learned that the size worked on women who let it work. And she had made the decision somewhere between Columbus Station and this desk that she was finished letting things work on her that only worked because she didn't fight back. "My father agreed to the original terms," she said. "He did not agree to altered payment credits, and he did not sign any document changing the interest calculation. If those documents exist, produce them. If they don't exist..." She let the rest of it stay unsaid, which was its own kind of complete sentence. Aldrich picked up his folder. "Mr. Carver will be in contact." "I expect so," Eleanor said. "Tell him to bring a lawyer. I'll be speaking to one myself this afternoon." He left. Eleanor sat perfectly still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pen and opened a fresh page in the ledger and wrote down every number from the conversation while it was still precise in her memory, including the exact moment when Aldrich's expression had changed and what question had caused it, because details mattered, and she intended to need every one of them. Then she put on her coat and went to find a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Horace Milband, and he practiced out of a small office 2 blocks from the courthouse. He was 60 years old, had the slight stoop of a man who had spent decades at a desk, and looked at Eleanor the way men of his generation looked at women who arrived alone and announced they were there on a business matter with a careful neutrality that could become either respect or dismissal, depending on what she gave him to work with. She gave him the ledger. She gave him the original loan documents. She gave him her calculations, set out on a clean page with every step of the arithmetic visible. She watched him read. He was quiet for a long time. "You did this yourself," he said. "I've kept books since I was 17, she said. "I kept these books specifically. I know what's there." He looked at the calculation page. "The discrepancy is consistent," he said. "It's not random undercounting. It's consistent, which means it's systematic." "Yes," she said. "That's not a mistake," he said. "No," she said. "It's not." He set the papers down. He looked at her over his spectacles. "Carver has relationships in this city," he said. "He's not a man who operates without certain accommodations in certain circles." "I understand that," Eleanor said. "Are you telling me you can't help me, or are you telling me I should know what I'm walking into?" He paused. Something shifted in his assessment of her. "I'm telling you what you're walking into," he said. "Then tell me what I need to build the case," she said. "I have the ledger evidence. What else?" He leaned back. He thought. "Witnesses," he said. "Any communication your father has from Carver or his agents, letters, notes, anything in writing. And the bank records of the actual payments made matched against the credits claimed. If you can show payment made and payment credited at a lower amount with documentation of both, that's fraud. Documented provable fraud." "The bank records," she said. "I need access to the bank records." "Your father would have to authorize that." She stood up. "Then I'll go see my father." She paid his consultation fee. She walked back through Columbus, which was loud and flat and nothing like the mountains, and she was aware of something that had been building in her chest over the past week that was not quite anger. It was cleaner than anger, more focused. It was the particular resolve of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had finally found a situation where being underestimated was an advantage, because Carver had sent Aldrich to deliver a number to a sick man's family and had expected the family to be frightened and confused and to pay. He had sent Aldrich to the wrong woman. Her father authorized the bank records from his bed. He sat up straighter than he had since she'd arrived, listening while she explained what she'd found. She didn't soften it. She'd told him she wouldn't spare him numbers, and she didn't. When she finished, he was quiet. "I should have told you when it started changing," he said. "You didn't know it was changing," she said. "You were paying what he asked and trusting that the amount was correct. That's not stupidity. That's how honest people behave with people they believe are also honest." "I knew something wasn't right," he said. He looked at his hands. I knew the number kept growing when it shouldn't have. I thought maybe I'd miscounted. Maybe I'd missed something." "That's what he was counting on," Eleanor said. "That you'd blame yourself instead of him." Her father looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to go after him," he said. "Yes. He's not a safe man to go after, Eleanor." "I know that." She met his eyes. "Do you want me to stop?" The question sat between them. "No," he said. "I don't." He reached out and put his hand over hers again, that same gesture from before the man who was trying to correct what he hadn't done enough of. "You're more like your grandmother than anyone knows," he said. "She would have gone after him too." She squeezed his hand and went to get the bank records. Caleb's letter arrived on a Monday morning that she didn't have time for it. She was in the middle of cross-referencing 3 years of bank statements against the payment credits in Carver's ledger, a process that required complete attention and left no room for distraction, and she heard her mother call up the stairs and set the letter on the corner of the desk, and told herself she'd read it when she'd finished the current column. She read it before she finished the current column. "Seedlings are doing well. Moved them to the south window last week because I noticed the east light was getting shorter and the far right one was looking tired. It's standing up better now. I'm not a gardener, but I can read a plant well enough to know when it needs something different. Tom asked about you. Dottie sent something. I'll send it on when I figure out how to pack it without it arriving in pieces. Ruth Calhoun told me yesterday that she hopes you're managing all right. She didn't say it like that, but I know Ruth. Come back when you're ready. The chair is there." She set the letter down. She picked it up again. "I'm not a gardener, but I can read a plant well enough to know when it needs something different." He'd moved the seedlings. He'd noticed the east light was getting shorter, and he'd moved them to where the light was better. Without being asked, without being told. He'd just looked at what was needed and done it. She sat with the letter for a moment longer than she should have, and then she folded it and put it with the others in the tin and went back to the bank statements, because that was what the day required. But she carried the seedlings with her through the rest of the afternoon. What? The confrontation she had been building toward arrived not on her schedule, but on Carver's. She was at the store on a Tuesday afternoon. Daniel was there also, which turned out to matter when a carriage stopped outside and 2 men came in. One was Aldrich. The other was a man she hadn't met but recognized immediately from Milban's description: medium height, well-dressed in a way that was specifically designed to communicate wealth, rather than simply resulting from it, with a face that had learned to be pleasant in the way that faces learned to be pleasant when pleasantness was useful. Carver. He came in smiling, which told her he'd decided on a strategy. "Miss Parker," he said, "I've heard a great deal about you." "I don't know what you've heard," she said, "but I expect it was accurate." He glanced at Daniel, who was standing behind the counter. "Perhaps we could speak privately." "My brother stays," she said. Something moved behind Carver's eyes. He adjusted. "Of course." He set a folder on the counter. "I understand there's been some confusion about the account." "There's no confusion," Eleanor said. "The account discrepancy is clear and documented." "Accounting errors happen," Carver said pleasantly, "over a long period of record-keeping." "These aren't errors," she said. "Errors are random. These are consistent. 12 payment credits recorded at lower amounts than the payments actually made over 14 consecutive months. That's not an error. That's a system." Carver looked at her. The pleasantness was still there, but it had a different quality now, the way a window had a different quality when what was behind it changed. "Your father," he said, "agreed to terms." "My father agreed to original terms," she said. "I have the original documents. What he did not agree to is any amendment to those terms because no such amendment was ever presented for his signature. If you have a document showing his signature on amended terms, I'd like to see it." Silence. "I'm working with Horace Milband," she said. "He has copies of everything I have. We've also filed a request with the court for a review of your business accounts as they pertain to this debt, not just my father's account, but a sampling of comparable accounts over the same period. Because I don't think my father is the only person you've done this to. That landed. She watched it land. Carver's face didn't fall apart. He was too practiced for that. But something went very still behind his eyes, and Aldrich shifted his weight beside him in the particular way of a man who suddenly wants to be somewhere else. "You're making a serious accusation," Carver said. "I'm describing what the ledgers show," Eleanor said. "The accusation is a matter for the court. I'm simply telling you where things stand so that you can make an informed decision about how you'd like to proceed." "And what would you consider an acceptable resolution?" Carver said. The pleasantness was mostly gone now. He was doing arithmetic. "Full correction of the payment credits," she said. "The actual payments my father made credited at the actual amounts. The balance recalculated at the original terms. The difference between what you claim is owed and what is actually owed returned, and a written release of the debt upon payment of the correct balance." "That's," Aldrich started. "That's what the arithmetic requires," Eleanor said. She didn't look at Aldrich. She kept her eyes on Carver. "The alternative is that Mr. Milband proceeds with the court filing, which becomes public record, which means your other borrowers start asking questions, which means this conversation we're having in private becomes considerably less private." Carver looked at her for a long moment. Daniel behind the counter was absolutely silent. "I'll need to consult with my accountant," Carver said finally. "Of course," Eleanor said. "Mr. Milband expects to hear from you or your representative by Friday." Carver picked up his folder. He looked at her one more time, and this look was different from all the others, stripped of the pleasantness and the strategy, and what was underneath was not quite respect, but it was something in that direction, the acknowledgement of a man who had encountered a force he had not accounted for. He left. Aldrich followed. The door closed. Daniel let out a breath he had clearly been holding for some time. "Eleanor," he said. "Don't," she said. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the counter so he wouldn't see. "Don't say anything for a minute." Daniel was quiet for a minute. "He's going to settle," she said when she was ready. "He doesn't want the court review. He has too many accounts that look like this one." "How do you know?" "Because he came himself," she said. "He didn't send Aldrich. He didn't send a lawyer. He came himself, which means he wanted to see what he was dealing with before he decided what to do. And he's decided." She took her hands off the counter. "He's going to settle. And if he doesn't, then we file," she said. "And we find out how many other families he's done this to, and we bring them into it." She picked up her ledger from beneath the counter. "But he's going to settle." She was right. Milband received a communication Thursday morning. Washant. The settlement terms took 2 days to finalize and were in the end almost exactly what Eleanor had specified in that Tuesday conversation. Not quite. Carver's people bargained on one point, and she gave them that point because giving them something minor made them feel less cornered, and a man who felt less cornered was a man who signed things. The remaining balance after correction was legitimate, and her father would pay it. But it was payable now, not the inflated number Carver had been collecting toward. Her father was sitting up when she brought him the signed papers. He read them. He read them again. He looked up at her. "How?" he said. "The numbers," she said simply. "They were always there. Someone just had to read them." He was quiet for a moment. "You should have been here," he said. "Running the books, all along." "I was in Columbus," she said. "And then I was in Colorado." She paused. "Father, I'm going back to Colorado." He looked at her. "When this is fully settled," she said, "when Daniel has what he needs and you're well enough, I'm going back." "To the mountain man," he said. "To Caleb," she said. "And to the house. And to the garden I've been trying to start for 3 months. And to—" She stopped, found the right word. "To my life." He looked at her with something in his face that she hadn't seen before, or had seen maybe, and not recognized because she hadn't been looking for it. Pride. Actual, uncomplicated pride directed at her, not at a modified version of her, or an aspirational version of her, but at the woman sitting in the chair beside his bed with signed papers in her hand. "Your grandmother," he said again. "You said that before. It's still true." He folded the papers carefully and handed them back to her. "Go back," he said. "When you're ready, go back." She wrote to Caleb that evening. "It's resolved. I won't go into everything now because it's a long story, and I'd rather tell it to you in person. My father is recovering. Daniel has what he needs. I'll be ready to leave within the week. The seedlings, please put them back in the east window for the next few days. The south light this time of year is too direct in the afternoons, and it'll stress them before transplant. I've been thinking about the south slope and the fence line, and whether we have enough time before frost for the first beds if I'm back by the 15th. I think we do if I'm organized about it. I am always organized about things." She hesitated over the next line for a long time. She wrote it anyway. "I have been thinking about 2 chairs on a porch. I have been thinking about it for 3 months. I wanted you to know that before I arrived so that you could decide how you feel about it and not have to figure it out while I'm standing in front of you. I'm not asking you for anything specific. I'm just not willing to arrive without having told you something that is true. It seems important to tell the truth clearly when you know it." She sealed the letter. She was not sure it would arrive before she did. She didn't mind. The day before she left Columbus, her sister Margaret came. She arrived in the morning and helped Eleanor pack, which mostly meant sitting on the bed and watching Eleanor pack, while talking steadily, the way Margaret had talked since childhood, the comforting continuous stream of someone who processed the world through speech. "You look different," Margaret said. It was the second person to say it. "I've been told. You look like you know something." Margaret watched Eleanor fold a dress with the particular efficient precision that had always characterized Eleanor's movements. "You look like a woman who knows where she's going and is ready to get there." "I am," Eleanor said. "Is he—" Margaret started and stopped. Is it a good situation?" "Truly." Eleanor put the dress in the trunk. She thought about what the truthful answer was. "He built me a house," she said, "before he knew who I was. He built it because he believed that the person coming deserved a place that was hers. He fixed my oven damper and didn't blame me for burned biscuits. He moved my seedlings to better light without being asked." She closed the trunk latch. "He tells me I matter, and he means it in the way that you can hear whether someone means it or not." Margaret was quiet. "That's a good situation," she said softly. "It is," Eleanor said. Margaret helped her carry the trunk downstairs. At the door, she hugged Eleanor the way she hadn't since they were girls. Not the polite, quick embrace of adult sisters, but the real kind, arms tight. The kind that meant something was being acknowledged, that words weren't quite right for. "Write to me," Margaret said. "I always do." "Write to me more," Margaret said. "I want to know about the seedlings." Eleanor laughed, real and sudden and full, and it felt like something that had been tightly coiled, finally being allowed to simply be. She left for the station the next morning. The train west took 4 days, the same as it always took, and Eleanor was a different person sitting in the same kind of seat, watching the land change under her in reverse. Ohio becoming Indiana, becoming Illinois. The land rising. The air coming through the window gap, changing its quality, thinning and sharpening, and she felt it like coming back to something she hadn't known she needed until she'd left it. She had done what needed doing. She had sat at her father's desk and read every number and named every wrong thing and stood in front of a man who expected her to be frightened and had told him clearly what the arithmetic required. She had not been loud about it. She had not needed to be loud. She had simply been exact, and exactness had been enough, and it had always been enough. It had always been her particular power, and she had spent 29 years living as though it wasn't. She was not going to keep doing that. She watched Kansas go past, and she thought about what she was returning to. A house that had been built for her. A slope with a fence line and tin can seedlings that had been moved to better light by a man who was not a gardener, but who paid attention to what things needed. 2 chairs. A valley. A community that had looked at her on a train platform and decided what she was and was in the process of being shown something different. And Caleb. She thought about the letter she'd sent, the one about the chairs, the one where she'd said she wanted to tell him something true before she arrived so he could decide how he felt without her standing in front of him. She didn't know if he'd received it. She didn't know what he'd done with it if he had. She thought about the way he'd taken her hand at the station. 3 seconds. The specific 3 seconds of a man holding something he wanted to hold before it went. She thought about "Come Back When You Can" and the seedlings in the south window and the 1/4-inch leveling on a kitchen shelf. She thought about being seen. She thought about a person who knew what it was to be invisible, who had chosen to see. The mountains appeared on the horizon on the morning of the 4th day, and Eleanor Parker sat up straighter in her seat and looked at them coming, and something that had been wound tight and careful in her chest for 3 months longer than the trip to Columbus, longer honestly than she could precisely trace, began to ease. She was going home. The word landed simply and without argument, and she let it stand. She was going home. Pine Hollow Station was quieter than the first time. Or maybe Eleanor was quieter. Maybe she was the variable that had changed, and the station was exactly what it had always been. The same platform, the same mountain air, cutting through the summer heat. The same particular quality of light that existed only at this elevation, and that she had been missing without a precise word for what she was missing until this moment when it was back. She stepped off the train. She had one more trunk than she'd left with. Her mother had pressed things on her linens, a cast-iron Dutch oven that had been in the family 20 years. A seed packet collection from the garden that her mother said she wasn't using anymore, but Eleanor suspected her mother was giving up on purpose. A form of blessing delivered in the practical language their family had always used for love. She stood on the platform and looked for him. He was there, not at the far end this time. He was right there, closer than before, as if the 3 months had altered something in the distance he felt the need to keep. He was holding his hat in his hands, the same way he'd held it the first time, and he was looking at her with the same concentration that had no room in it for anything else. She walked to him. They stood 2 feet apart, and she looked at his face, weathered and steady and completely without performance, and she thought about tin can seedlings moved to better light, and she thought about "Come Back When You Can," and she thought about 3 seconds at a train station in the other direction. "You're back," he said. "I told you I would be." He looked at her for a moment longer. "You look different. I've been told that twice now," she said. "The first time was my father. What does it mean when you say it?" "It means—" He stopped, tried again. "It means you look like someone who did something hard and knows it." "I did do something hard," she said. "I know. I got your letter." "Which one?" He held her eyes. "All of them," he said. "But I expect you mean the last one." She held his gaze and did not look away. "I meant what I said in it." "I know you did." He put his hat back on. He reached past her and picked up her trunk, the heavy one, the one with her mother's Dutch oven and the seed packets and the linens, and settled it under his arm. "The seedlings are in the east window," he said. "Moved them back 4 days ago like you said." "How's the far right one?" "Standing up," he said. "Stubborn little thing." Something moved through her chest. "Good," she said. They walked to the wagon. They were halfway up the mountain before either of them said anything that mattered. The road required attention in places, and Caleb gave it that attention, and Eleanor sat beside him on the wagon bench and watched the mountains move around them in the way she'd missed without having the language for missing them, and she let the silence run, because she'd learned that with him, silence wasn't absence. It was just the space between words where things also happened. Then he said, "I want to say something, and I'd like you to let me finish before you respond." She looked at him. He was watching the road. "All right." "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you wrote, about the chairs, about telling me something true before you arrived, so I'd have time to figure out how I felt about it." He paused. I've had 3 months. And I'm getting there. He kept his eyes on the road. When Clara died, I decided that the thing to do was to stop wanting things that could be taken. You build a wall high enough and nothing gets over it. I was good at that wall for 7 years. He adjusted his hold on the reins. Then you wrote me a letter. Eleanor was very still. And I find that pretending takes up energy better spent elsewhere, he said. And something happened that I did not plan for, which is that I wanted to write back. And I kept wanting to write back. And then you were here, and I kept finding reasons to be near the problem you were currently solving. The damper, the shelves, the seedlings. He glanced at her brief. I am aware that I am not subtle. You told me that was me calling it out, she said. You were right, he said. I was looking after you because I wanted to look after you. Because you mattered to me. He stopped. The wagon moved. Eleanor, you matter to me in a way that the wall I built doesn't have room for anymore. I've been aware of that since approximately the 2nd week. I'm telling you now because you were honest with me, and you deserve the same back. She looked at his profile, the steadiness of it, the jaw set with the specific tension of a man saying something true at a cost. Caleb, she said. Yeah. Are you asking me something? He was quiet for a moment. I reckon I am. Then ask it plainly, she said. I told you I was too tired to guess. He pulled the wagon to a stop at the top of the rise where the property came into view, the main house and her house, and the garden fence and the slope she'd measured with a rope and a stick. He set the brake and turned on the bench to face her directly. I'm asking you to stay, he said. Not the way you've been staying as the woman in the house I built. I'm asking you to stay as... He stopped. Found it. As mine. And I'd like to be yours, if that's something you want. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the first letter she'd almost didn't write. She thought about beauty optional and what it had meant and whether she'd been right about what it meant, and she'd been right. She'd been right from the beginning about who this man was. And there was something almost unbearable about that, about having guessed correctly at something this important. I moved 4 days on a train to get back here, she said. I know. I turned down my brother's offer to stay in Columbus and help run the store. You didn't tell me that, he said. Daniel asked. He said I had a future there. I told him I already had one. She held his eyes. I've been yours since approximately the 2nd week also. I just didn't say it because I was afraid. Afraid of what? That I'd gotten it wrong, she said. That I'd built something in my head out of letters and kindness and oven dampers, and the want of it would embarrass me. She looked at him. I don't get things like this wrong, Caleb. I'm very careful with numbers, and I know when they add up. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand. Not 3 seconds this time. He just held it. All right, he said. All right, she said. He released the brake. The wagon moved forward. Her hand stayed in his the rest of the way up the mountain. They were married 6 weeks later. Not because 6 weeks was the expected interval, but because that was how long it took for Eleanor to finish transplanting the seedlings to the south slope beds, the ones the fence line protected, and for Caleb to build the additional shelving in her library that she'd been measuring for since May, and for both of them to agree that they had practical matters in hand and could afford the time that a proper ceremony required. Tom Greer stood up with Caleb. Dottie Greer cried during the vows, which she announced in advance she intended to do, and considered nobody's business to comment on. Ruth Calhoun brought a pie. She brought it herself, drove it up the mountain in her own wagon, and handed it to Eleanor at the door before the guests arrived, and said without preamble, "It's blueberry. Caleb's always liked blueberry." She paused. "You're good for him. I was wrong to suggest otherwise." Eleanor accepted the pie. "You were trying to protect him," she said. "I was trying to protect him," Ruth agreed, "from the wrong thing." She looked at Eleanor directly. "You're not something he needs protection from." "I know," Eleanor said. He said the same thing to me once. Something passed across Ruth Calhoun's face, something warm and brief and entirely real. "Good," she said, and went inside. The ceremony was held beside the house, Eleanor's house. Her porch, her 2 chairs, the garden fence behind them with the first transplants already taking hold in the mountain soil. Caleb stood in his good jacket with the expression of a man who had decided something completely and was at peace with having decided it. And when she came to stand in front of him, he looked at her the way he had looked at her on the train platform that very first day, with a concentration that had no room in it for anything else. The minister spoke. Eleanor heard the words and spoke the words and felt them settle into her in the way of things that were simply and permanently true. When it was over, Caleb touched her face once briefly with the back of his hand, the most tender gesture she had seen from him, and the more powerful for being brief, and then said very quietly just to her, "Welcome home." She had been home for 6 weeks. She had been home since the wagon crested the mountain road and she saw the fence line. She had been home since she read "Come Back When You Can" and understood that someone was waiting for her without requiring that she hurry. But she received the words anyway fully, because some truths bore saying twice. October came. The first frost came with it, which Eleanor had anticipated by 3 days, and had used those 3 days to bring in everything that needed to come in. Working the south slope with Caleb, in the early mornings, when the air had the specific cold edge of Colorado autumn shifting into something serious. The beds were cleared and mulched. The preserved vegetables were in the cellar. The small jars of jam, 4 kinds, more than they'd need, but exactly what Eleanor had intended, were lined on the kitchen shelves in straight rows. She was in the library on a Friday evening, working through correspondence. She had agreed to keep books for 2 businesses in Pine Hollow, a decision that had required some negotiation, because she'd made clear she would keep them at her rate and on her schedule. And the business owners had initially blinked at both conditions and then agreed because Eleanor's reputation had shifted in Pine Hollow over the preceding months, in ways that even Pete Hadley had not argued with lately. Caleb came in from outside and stopped in the library doorway. "Tom's here," he said. "What does he want?" "He wants to talk to you." A pause. "About a problem with his books." Eleanor set down her pen. "His books are a disaster," she said. "I told him that in August." "He knows. He wants help fixing them." "He should have come in August." "He's stubborn," Caleb said with the tone of a man who considered this self-evident. "He's stubborn," she agreed. She picked up her pen again and finished the number she'd been writing. Then she capped the ink and stood up. "Tell him coffee first, and he's paying my rate." She heard Caleb relay this to Tom in the other room, and heard Tom's response, which was theatrical indignation, followed by agreement, because Tom Greer was a man who performed reluctance before doing exactly what he intended to do, and Eleanor had known this about him since the fence posts. She went to put the coffee on, and she was aware, moving through her kitchen with its organized shelves and its level surfaces and its window where the seedlings had started and were now in the ground. Down the slope where they belonged, she was aware of the specific quality of this life. She was moving through the weight and texture of it, the realness of it, against her hands. She had built this. Not alone, but she had built it. The letter from Daniel came in November. He wrote to say the store was doing well. He wrote to say their father had recovered enough to come downstairs for meals. He wrote to say that Horace Milband had quietly notified him that 2 other families had come forward regarding Carver after the court review filing became partially public record, and that Carver's operation was under formal investigation, and that Milband had said, and Daniel wrote this with underlines because Daniel was a man who used underlines. Your sister's documentation was the foundation of everything that followed. Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table with Caleb sitting across from her. She handed it to him when she finished. He read it. He set it down. 2 other families, he said. "At least," she said. "There are probably more." He looked at her. "You knew that when you were in Columbus." "I suspected it," she said. "That's why I asked Milband to file for the broader review. If I'd only asked him to address my father's account, Carver would have settled quietly, and done it to someone else next year. Caleb was quiet for a moment. You were thinking about people you'd never met. I was thinking about what was right, she said. He picked up the letter and read Daniel's underlined sentence again. He set it down. He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to know as his most honest one, the one with nothing performing and nothing held back. Eleanor, he said. Don't, she said, because she could see what was coming, and she was not sure she could receive it without the inconvenient throat situation arising. I'm going to say it anyway, he said. You walked into this town and people decided what you were before you opened your mouth. And you went ahead and were exactly who you are, and who you are turned out to be someone who fixed her father's business and stopped a fraud operation and built a kitchen garden and taught Tom Greer to read a ledger. And he stopped. I knew from your first letter, he said. I knew what you were. I want you to know I knew. She pressed her lips together. The far-right seedling, she said finally. He blinked. What? In your letter, you said it was stubborn. You said you'd been giving it extra patience. She looked at him. That's the one that came up tallest. It's in the ground now, down on the slope. It's doing better than any of the others. He held her eyes. Slow isn't the same as wrong, she said. Sometimes it just means the roots are going deeper. He looked at her for a long moment with the almost smile that had gotten closer and closer to an actual smile over the months until eventually it had become the real thing. And it was the real thing, now quiet and certain and completely his. Come here, he said. She got up from her chair and came around the table and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her with the ease of something that had always been there waiting to happen, and she leaned against him, and they sat at the kitchen table together with Daniel's letter in front of them and November pressing against the windows. He's right about the foundation, Caleb said after a while. What? Millband. What he told Daniel. His voice was quiet matter-of-fact, the way he was always matter-of-fact about the things he meant most. You were the foundation. For all of it. She thought about that. She thought about a woman who had spent 29 years believing that the world had decided correctly about her value, and who had mailed a letter to a mountain man on a February morning because 2 words in a newspaper had cracked something open. She thought about what had been built since. Not just the house, not just the garden or the business accounts or the kitchen shelves. The actual thing. The life. The foundation of a life that had been constructed deliberately and honestly by 2 people who understood what it was to be invisible and had chosen specifically and with full knowledge of what they were doing to see each other. Caleb, she said. Yeah, the advertisement you placed, she said. Back in the fall. Beauty optional. What about it? Did you know what you were doing when you wrote that? He thought about it. He always thought about things honestly. I knew what I didn't want, he said. I didn't want to sort through women who were trying to be what they thought I wanted. I'd had enough of people performing things. He paused. I reckon I was hoping someone would write back who was done performing. I was done performing, she said. I know, he said. I could tell from the first sentence. She turned her head and looked at him. 2 words, she said. Beauty optional. That's what did it. What did it for me was I find that pretending takes up energy better spent elsewhere, he said. That was the line. She remembered writing it. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table in Columbus with the newspaper folded open and the coffee going cold and the sensation of reaching for something she was afraid to want. I almost didn't send it, she said. I know, he said. How do you know? Because of how careful the rest of it was, he said. That one sentence came from somewhere else. The rest of the letter was managed. That sentence wasn't. She stared at him. You read my letters very carefully. More than once, he said. I told you that the first day. She looked back at the table. Outside, the wind came off the mountain, the way it had since October, steady and cold and clean. And inside the kitchen was warm from the stove. And the letter from Daniel was on the table. And Caleb's arm was around her. And the shelves were level, and the seedlings were in the ground, and the 2 chairs were on the porch under the first inch of November snow. "I need to write to Margaret," she said. She asked about the seedlings. "Write to her," he said. "She'll want to know about the far right one." "Tell her about it," he said. "Tell her it came up tallest." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then, "Caleb." "Yeah." "I'm glad I sent the letter." His arm tightened slightly around her. Just slightly. Just enough. "So am I," he said. She reached out and took Daniel's letter from the table and folded it neatly and set it in the correspondence tin beside her mother's recipe cards, where it would stay, where all the things that had led to this would stay. The evidence of a life accumulated by a woman who had stopped pretending and started building, who had walked onto a train platform in a brown dress with a crumpled letter in her hand, and had refused to become smaller when the world told her to, who had stood in a general store and in a lawyer's office and in front of a man who expected her to be frightened and had been in every room exactly who she was. She had been exactly who she was, and it had been enough. It had been more than enough. It had been everything.